You know that feeling when you just can't put a book down? You tell yourself just one more chapter and suddenly it's 3 a.m. Well, that whole binge read experience, that's not an accident. Turns out it was designed that way. Today, we're going to dive into the surprisingly recent history of the novel and find out how it totally changed storytelling forever.
But hang on, that kind of begs the question, right? We all feel like we know what a novel is. But what are the actual rules? What's the real difference between a novel and, say, an epic poem or a play?
All right, so before we can get into its origin story, we have to know what we're actually talking about. Let's really quickly break down the basic building blocks of what makes a novel a novel.
Okay, so at the very top level, it's super simple. You've got nonfiction, the real world, facts, and then you have fiction, the world of make believe. And right there, nestled under fiction, is our subject, the novel, hanging out with its shorter relatives, the novella and the short story. So, what was the big idea that changed everything? Well, back in the 18th century, the first real definition was almost shockingly simple: a very long narrative in prose. Now, just think about that for a second. Before novels, the biggest stories were told in verse, as poems or plays. The idea of a huge story told in just normal, everyday language, that was completely revolutionary. And that long narrative has a pretty specific recipe. A novel has some key ingredients. It's chopped up into chapters, which gives it that episodic, just one more feeling. It's got a main character, a protagonist, surrounded by a whole cast of other people. There's a main plot with a bunch of little subplots weaving in and out. It's all built around a central theme, told from a specific point of view, and takes place in a clearly defined setting. Okay, so with that definition locked in, let's jump in our time machine. We're heading back to where it all kicked off, the early 1700s in England. This period was called the Augustan Age, and it was basically the launchpad for the modern novel. Right from the very beginning, the novel kind of split into two main tracks. On one hand, you had these deeply personal, emotional stories, a lot of them told through letters, really digging into what the characters were thinking and feeling. And on the other hand, pure adventure. Stories like Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver's Travels took readers to these wild, exotic places they could only dream about. But even back then, you had your rebels. A guy named Lawrence Sterne wrote a book called Tristram Shandy, and it was something else. It was weird, it was hilarious, and it totally ignored the idea of telling a story in a straight line. It really shows that from the get-go, authors were already pushing the limits of what a novel could be, giving a little preview of the experimental stuff that would come centuries later. So as we move into the late 1700s and early 1800s, things in the real world were getting pretty chaotic. You had the French Revolution, this new romantic spirit that was all about big emotions and the individual, and all of this change created a demand for totally new kinds of stories. The novel, of course, stepped up. And this period gave us two absolute powerhouse genres. First, the Gothic novel, which dove headfirst into horror, mystery, and the supernatural. Yep, this is the great-great-granddaddy of all our modern horror movies and books. But at the exact same time, you had the novel of manners, which was all about looking inward at the complicated social rules and marriage dramas of the upper class. And the master of that, of course, was Jane Austen. All right, now we're entering what a lot of people call the golden era of the novel. We're in the mid to late 19th century, the Victorian period. This is when the novel didn't just get popular, it became the main form of entertainment. It was everything. The big idea powering this whole golden age was a movement called realism, and the name says it all. The goal was to show life and the world exactly as it was, warts and all. And why then? Well, the Industrial Revolution was changing everything super fast. People wanted stories about real folks dealing with the messy, complicated problems of this new modern age. And realism wasn't just one thing. It had all these different flavors, each one like a different camera lens for looking at the world. You had psychological realism, which explored what was going on inside a character's head. You had social realism, which took on huge issues like poverty and class. There were even novels all about the new factories and the sprawling British Empire. The novel really had become a mirror, reflecting every single part of life. So, think about it. We went from a simple, long narrative in prose, all the way through adventure, horror, and gritty realism. For more than 300 years, the novel has just kept changing, kept reinventing itself to match the world around it. And that just leaves us with one last question to chew on. In our own crazy, fast-changing world, what's next for the novel?